Of course, if you can get the geometry in SketchUp, like this small model over here, you can create the proxy itself here using the proxy export option of V-Ray. So let's say I want to convert this one to a proxy. I can click the button, specify an output path, and V-Ray will ask me whether I want to replace the actual geometry with the proxy one, and it will happen automatically. The cool part is if you have different materials applied to different parts of the mesh, V-Ray will see that. It will be smart in that way. So it will automatically reapply the materials to the proxy, and I can just click the render button and see the model. Of course, one tree on its own or one plant will not be that great in an actual project. I want to duplicate that a lot of times. In SketchUp, you can do that with Scatter or with any other plugin. Lately, I've been using the Raycaster plugins of TomTom. He has really great tools for SketchUp, so I can just enable the spray can and put a bunch of objects around. And it doesn't matter how many times I instance the geometry around, V-Ray will be extremely fast and adequate when loading all the meshes. Okay, so in V-Ray 3 we have added something else really cool, which lets you create vegetation like that, and it's the V-Ray fur. In that case, the V-Ray fur will be used for creating grass. So it's perfect for grass or rocks, as an example. So let me select the ground geometry this time, and click on the V-Ray fur icon on the toolbar. This one will automatically create the fur geometry. It will attach it to the ground, and then I can start playing with different parameters even while rendering in V-Ray RT. So let me set my distribution low as a starting point, and then I'll hit the render button. So those are the grass strands that you get out of the box. So there are multiple tweaks that I can do to make that grass look better. For example, I can increase the length, and I can also make the grass denser. And of course, you have a bunch of really cool parameters that let you control the density, the length, the randomness, or the colors of the strands. Every time you render grass with V-Ray, the best idea is to use the V-Ray hair material. It's the most optimized shader for rendering things like that. That's a new addition again in V-Ray 3. Let me throw in a V-Ray hair material. Select the glass geometry, and I'll just apply the material. And for some reason, come on. Yeah. So out of the box, the hair material is brown, of course, because it's meant to be used for hair. But with a simple tweak, I can make it from a brown material to something that looks more like a grass. Wow, and that's, my grass is too long right now. Let me make it a little bit shorter, and you can see how easy it is to use this tool. You don't need any additional plugins. You can create grass fields like that. Of course, this option is also available in Rhino. Currently, it's not in Revit, but we're planning to have some kind of implementation of that in there soon. Okay, so using that same tools, we're actually able to create this set real easy. And the trees that you can see in the back is the 5 million polygon tree that I showed you earlier. So I think I'm running a little bit late on time, but otherwise I have the scene and I can show you the scene in action on my system. And this is the night shot of the same thing. Okay, another really cool thing is the V-Ray Clipper. It was again introduced in V-Ray 3. It lets you create real-time Boolean operations during render time without affecting the geometry of your scene. And that's extremely important because sometimes it's just impossible to cut the meshes in the set. They're too complicated, or you want to have a non-destructive workflow. So let me go in SketchUp and show that in practice. So here is the geometry that I'll be working with, and I'll start the interactive rendering process. So I basically want to cut this cabinet, and there are two ways to achieve that in SketchUp. The first one is if you go to Tools, create a section plane. And I'm a little bit clumsy because my mouse is really tight over here. I don't have a lot of space to move it. But basically, the section cuts of SketchUp are handled as section planes or V-Ray clippers in the asset editor. And there are different options which you can apply, and they will actually affect the SketchUp viewport as well. So I can enable, disable the clipper. Everything is 100% interactive. So let me delete this one, and I will enable another layer. So another option that is available to you is you can create custom meshes and clip with them. So I can create a custom geometry, tell V-Ray this is a clipper, and V-Ray will create the Boolean operation with that object. And the best part is that I can only clip some parts of the set and leave other parts untouched. So with this one visible, I'll restart the rendering process, and you can see how quickly this gets resolved. There are a bunch of useful options in the clipper. Just to give you an example, you can have a custom material applied to the clipper, like in my case. So let me make it red so that you can see it better. But at the same time, you can also say use object material, and the clipper will use the base material of the base geometry. So that's really handy. Of course, in the future, we're looking forward to letting you animate the clipper so that you can render animations of, for example, building being created from the ground up, and you can render that whole animation. Currently, that's still not possible in SketchUp. You can do it in 3ds Max, for example. Okay, so the physical camera controls have also been improved quite a bit in this new version. If I load another scene example, I'll be able to demonstrate that in practice. So here is the scene that I'll be working with. Again, I'll start the interactive engine, and I'll start interacting with my set. So if I load the asset editor, you will see that there is a camera section, and in this camera section we have just two options. You can change the exposure value of the camera, like for example, making it like decreasing the number will make the exposure higher, and if I increase it, the image will get dark. Okay, and you also have white balance as we did before with V-Ray 2. So I can filter my image easily, and if I set a gray color, gray shade, the white balance will have no effect. And the best part about using exposure value or EV is that I can enable depth of field and introduce some blurring in my image, and then I can still control the defocus amount without affecting the exposure. So this one will work like an automatic mode of your handheld real-world camera. So let's say I want to decrease the depth of field. I'll set the defocus to 0.3. And you'll see that the exposure remains exactly the same. If you still want access to the previous or the advanced cameras options, you can switch from the basic camera to the advanced camera, and you still have the ability to control film sensitivity, aperture, and shutter speed. This time, changing the aperture, for example, to 3, will affect the exposure, but the best part is that these options are linked. So if I change something in the advanced parameters, the EV value will change automatically. So it's really intuitive to work with the basic and the advanced cameras together all the time and switch between one and the other. When we deal with depth of field, there's another really cool thing that I can do. I can enable the pick focus point tool, click anywhere in the set, and V-Ray will change the focus distance in the rendered image. And probably this depth of field is too strong right now. So you don't need to be an expert to deal with that camera, and I find it really easy to set up my scenes using that new version. Okay. So now, light management. You have probably already noticed that there's a light section in V-Ray, and this really cool light icons on the left is something that we introduced with the last update. So you can basically disable or enable lights like that. You can rename the light sources, or you can access the more advanced options on the right-hand side. So here I have a short video of me playing with different lights in this particular set, and you'll get a feeling of what it's like to use that new UI. So the first lights that I'm using are rectangular lights, very standard. There are a couple of new options that we recently added. As an example, there's a light directionality. This option will basically point the light rays more towards one direction and not have them so spread out. So here I'm changing the light setup multiple times. I'm using the light intensity tool in order to control light intensities in the viewport of SketchUp itself. And now you'll see examples of some other light sources. So this is the spotlight. And this is the IS light. Again, something new which we introduced in V-Ray 3 is the mesh light. So the mesh light source is a tool that lets you select geometry from your scene and apply and turn it into a light source. In that case, I have the small strips under the steps, and I'm just converting them to a mesh light, and they start emitting direct illumination. Then I enabled this tube-like shape, converted this one to a mesh light as well, and you can see the results you can get. So this is extremely useful if you want custom light shapes rendered in the best or the fastest possible way. Okay. Another way to illuminate your set is with the sun and sky system of V-Ray, which in SketchUp is enabled by default. So let me load a scene. I think this was the right one. And here's what I have. I have this exterior setup, and it's lit using the V-Ray Sun and Sky system. And that's what we get out of the box. So you can see that in V-Ray 3 we actually have a ground in the sky system itself. Previously it was just bright towards the ground. This one is called the ground albedo. It can be controlled in color or in its position. So let me go to the sky settings and show that. So in the V-Ray Sun, there's the ground albedo options. So you can easily change the color of the albedo, making it blue, for example. And I can also tweak the blend angle or offset the whole thing down or up, which is extremely handy, especially in my scene example over here. So set this to 40. Another thing that you have probably noticed is that I have a new sky model enabled, and this is the Hosek et al. Sky model. It creates a really nice blue gradient for the sky. It works better than the previous V-Ray models. Again, it was requested by clients of ours, and we decided to add it and set it by default in the new version. Okay, so let me improve this image a little bit. So what I want to do is add some kind of a background. And I'll do that by enabling a layer, and you can see a bunch of mountains in the back and also a couple of V-Ray proxies. But when you look at aerial shots like this one, this one doesn't really look very natural, because in the real world you actually have depth, atmospheric depth. So there are particles in the air, so everything in the distance gets brighter and more bluish because of the sky illumination. So in V-Ray for 3ds Max, V-Ray 2 for 3ds Max, you could do that with the V-Ray environment fog effect, but the environment fog is expensive effect to calculate, because it requires V-Ray to trace illumination from the sky and illuminate the volumetric in the air using that data. That's why in V-Ray 3 we have added a new effect called aerial perspective. And it will do something similar to the environment fog, but it's almost free to render, so it's super fast. It will not affect your render times, but it will still be illuminated based on the skylight. So you can see that right out of the box, I get pretty nice results in my background. And of course, it has some parameters. You can make it thicker or less dense, and you can also control the height and just compress the effect close to the ground. Okay. And yeah, so those are different examples rendered with the aerial perspective and the Hosek sky model. Of course, moving the sun will also affect the whole set. So another really cool thing that we have improved in V-Ray 3 is the color correction capabilities of the V-Ray frame buffer. So we have a lot more options now, so you can play with exposure, contrast, white balance in the frame buffer, so you don't even have to do that in the physical camera. Color balance, which I love to use lately. So this one will let me tint the shadows, tint the highlights, or the midtones separately and create more advanced effects. And of course, one of the irreplaceable tools is, of course, the V-Ray curves, which will let you increase the contrast in a more custom way and create something better. So especially looking at that image on the projector, there's a lot that can be improved. The best part about the settings is that they can be saved and loaded to files. We support a V-Ray proprietary format, which will let you save them and load them in the frame buffer. If you want to save them and use them in Photoshop, we have a specific, we can export a LUT, LUT color correction, which is a .cube file. Then this file can be loaded in Photoshop and you'll see the exactly same color corrections in there, and you can use them. Another really neat thing is that images can be saved in the frame buffer history, and they're saved with the color corrections. This means that at any point I can right click and say load color corrections, and they'll be loaded in my actual final rendered image. Another technique that I use is I'll set my history to a custom folder that I have created. Let's say here. And this will replace my history images with some pre-rendered images, pre-rendered balloon image, which was color corrected and saved multiple times. And the cool thing about this one is it will let me load different color corrections and experiment with different looks of my image, sort of an Instagram style, basically. Yeah. So let me go back to my original history folder in case I need it, and I'll use this one, right? Okay, and of course, another way to illuminate your set is with the V-Ray dome light. That's a great tool when it comes to image-based lighting. If you have high-quality HDR images, the dome light is the perfect solution if you want to create exterior shots. And just changing the texture in the dome light will make a difference between a daytime setup and a nighttime setup, or a warm light coming from the sky, or a cool lighting. I will not show that in practice because I'm running late on time, but this image here was rendered using the dome light, and the really nice lens effects that you see over here were again an additional effect introduced in the V-Ray frame buffer, and that can be easily controlled like the color corrections. And now we get to a really interesting part, or something really cool that was added to the new version of V-Ray. We have a ready-made material library with more than 500 materials that ship with SketchUp and V-Ray for Rhino as well, and will ship with the next version of V-Ray for Revit. And just to put that in perspective, I have loaded some thumbnails of the material library materials. You can see that they're organized in different categories. So we have bricks, car paints, like ceramics, concrete. diagrammatic materials, self-illuminated fabrics, and so on and so forth. Really cool ones are, and I'll try to scroll to the bottom, the wooden surfaces, so you get textures like that out of the box. You don't have to do anything, and usually it's a big pain to create textures like that, but we spend the time to do it, and now you have access to it. So currently the material library textures are limited to 1K. In the future we have 4K versions of the same textures. We have to decide how we want to distribute those textures, probably using a web-based platform or something, and you have access to high-res textures on top of that. In SketchUp, I did record a video, which is a scene that I set up from scratch using the material library materials, and it's been speeded up, but the full runtime of this video is like 15 minutes. So I was able to start with a gray scene and set it up to a final quality render for less than 15 minutes, only using material library materials. Another thing I want to point out is that you can see that the material swatch over here changes depending on the material type, and you can manually do that. For example, if you want to create a flooring, you can change the swatch to a floor type swatch and preview your material this way. Another thing I want to point out here is that some of the materials were designed to be edited. So for example, I create a green wall, but then I can change the colors of the wall according to my needs. So the design and the structure of the materials is meant for you to do that. So just push the video. Of course, I'm using Swarm because why not? We have the render farm, and that's like the final rendered image. All the materials here are materials from the library. Okay, another really cool addition was the newly introduced subsurface scattering material. This is an image from our overview video, which is sort of a small plastic model of this building, and this subsurface scattering material was irreplaceable tool in that case. So let me go back to SketchUp, and I just have to find a scene. Multi-set, no, not this one. Textures, okay. So this is a really simple example that I created here, but the subsurface scattering material can be created from the Create menu, of course. Here it is. And another option is you can go to the library, go, for example, to the foam material section, and you have a bunch of presets of subsurface scattering materials that you can directly apply to your models. And you can see how quickly this material is rendered. Of course, you have to be careful. It's not the fastest shader for V-Ray to evaluate, but at the end of the day, the effect is pretty impressive. Another thing that we have introduced when it comes to material creation and texturing is a bunch of procedural textures that will save a lot of time and effort. So in this example scene, I wanted to do a couple of things with my wooden houses. The first problem I saw was that those houses have really sharp corners, which is not natural at all. Like usually you want to have rounded corners of every geometry. This makes up for a really nice, better looking image. And that's not easy to do sometimes because of the nature of the modeling package or the model itself. So sometimes you just cannot model the small details. For that particular reason, in V-Ray, we have added a really cool way to do that. So if I apply a bump map to those materials, and this bump map can be set to a V-Ray edges texture, I will get the rounded corners out of the box. And this is a really fast effect for V-Ray. It's not creating geometry. It's actually manipulating the normals of the mesh so that it looks like it's curved. And that's an effect you can use all over your projects to increase the realism in there. Another cool texturing technique that you can apply is, for example, let me select the material of the houses, and I will enable a mixed texture. In that case, I'm using a fall-off map. Again, this is new to in V-Ray 3. And using the fall-off map, I'm tracing which parts of the houses are facing up and which parts are facing to the sides. And this way I can easily color the rooftops, leaving everything on the side untouched. I can also go one step further, and let's say these green parts, I want to make them out of wood. So in order to achieve that, I have used yet another new texture, which is called the V-Ray Triplanar map. And the triplanar map will let you apply textures without having to create UVs for the geometries, which is extremely important in SketchUp, because managing UVs in SketchUp can be a big pain. So the triplanar will just project the texture, and you can clearly see how the texture is being rotated for the separate houses. And that's because the triplanar map can randomize the texture rotation or the texture positioning to create this really natural look. For the rooftops, I can use a different technique. So let's say I want to have random colors for all the houses' rooftops. I will enable another new texture, V-Ray 3 texture, which is the multi-sub texture. This one lets you specify a bunch of colors or maps, or actual bitmaps, and it will randomize the maps in between different objects. And this is extremely useful in that particular case, but it can also work for a field of grass strands or trees or some other vegetation. It can randomize colors or textures rather easily. Okay. Yeah, so you already saw that, and this brings me to virtual reality. You already saw a couple of examples of that. Setting up a VR shot in SketchUp is an easier process than ever. So here's a video of how I do it. So this is my interior scene, which has been finalized. I do render a standard camera, and if I want to do a VR shot, I'll just change the camera position, enable spherical panorama camera or VR cube map cameras. V-Ray will take care of my image resolution automatically, so there's nothing else that I should do. And I can render a stereo or a non-stereo virtual reality image easily. So there's not a lot of manual work, it's just a toggle and changing the camera mode. And you can basically send this image straight to your Gear VR, or you can use it with the cardboard or whatever you like. Of course, another thing that I want to talk about briefly is the render elements. So in V-Ray 3, we have improved the way in which render elements are handled. There's a new way to create them. So users can just go to the render element section, write the name of the element, let's say denoiser for denoiser, or diffuse for the diffuse filter, and continue on working from there. A special render elements that can be applied to your set are the V-Ray denoiser, of course, and also the extra texture render element, which will allow you to create custom render passes. So when you think about render elements, you can think about them in three different ways. The first one is you can split your image into different layers, which can be edited afterwards in the post-production application. You can create render elements for masking or selecting different objects in post. Or you can create elements which let you introduce special effects afterwards, like the Z-depth on the left can give me the ability to add depth of field in after the fact, and the extra texture with the V-Ray dirt map on the right gives me ambient occlusion pass that can be used afterwards. Another cool thing that you can always do is export your scene as a VRScene file, and as you already saw, you can bring it in 3ds Max and render it with all the geometry visible and all the materials available as well. In 3ds Max, lights are still not supported. In Maya, all the lights are supported, so we're moving in that direction, and this workflow will be improved in the future quite a bit. Okay, so now I will spend a couple of minutes showing you or talking about V-Ray for Rhino. The main idea here is that V-Ray for Rhino is basically exactly the same as V-Ray for SketchUp, and that's the best part about it. So if you have mixed specialists in your studios, like some people using Rhino, some people using SketchUp, they'll be able to share their workflows because the interface and the workflow is exactly identical. So here's the new UI in Rhino, here's the library, the advanced options on the other side. So instead of me showing everything in practice again and repeating myself, I'll just show you a couple of cool images that we did render for the overview video, which I think turned out pretty nicely. So this is a plastic model of a set that we did model. So of course the new UI is there, the V-Ray 3 core is there, and all the optimizations. Swarm is available in Rhino as well. The physical camera controls. The section cuts. So there's a small limitation in Rhino that I should mention. We still can only render V-Ray Clipper as a plane. Custom geometries are not supported. We have to figure out how to manage that in Rhino, and we'll have it there because it's in the V-Ray core. The material library is of course available. In case you deal with product designs, you have additional materials for product designs as well, like car paints and different metallic paints and so on. The V-Ray grass has been applied in this set for the V-Ray fur, for rendering the grass. The sky and the aerial perspective are available for the realistic shot, and also the dome light is an option. And the virtual reality cameras are controlled exactly the same way as you saw in SketchUp. Of course, there are a couple of differences in Rhino, and that's something that I want to show you in practice. And the first one is we have a full V-Ray integration or V-Ray components inside of Grasshopper. So let's go in Rhino and open an example scene of that. So I'll use this one. So let me load Grasshopper, and I'll show you a simple workflow that you can apply. So the geometry that you'll see created here is part of the building, the plastic model building. It's one of the Mashrabi elements. And the graph node is pretty complicated, so it took a while for it to load. So that's the whole thing. It's kind of confusing, but it works at the end. And you can actually control different parameters. It's all parametric. And what you can do with V-Ray with this one is, like with V-Ray 2, you can always bake the geometry and then render it. That's like the standard workflow. But then if you change something in the graph node, you have to rebake the geometry and repeat that process multiple times. And we thought, well, why not just render the parametric surface right out of the box without making people bake the geo. And in V-Ray 3, that's in fact possible. You can do it in a couple of different ways. The first one is I can go to the rendering tab of Grasshopper, and here we have a bunch of V-Ray nodes that can be created. So the first way to render this mesh is you can create a camera over here. Then you can create lights, connect them to the camera. So in my case, I'm using a mesh light. Then you can create a simple material, add the mesh, and create a V-Ray renderer. And that's the long way of making it work. But right now, if I enable this node, you will see that V-Ray will render this geometry 100% procedurally. So, okay, I didn't select it. Okay, so here it is. And if I want to change the material, change the camera, or change the lighting, I should go back in the graph and basically tweak the V-Ray components. But in fact, you don't have to go through that whole process in order to render the mesh. We have another section which is called Simple Render. And this one will allow you to render with V-Ray RT easily without creating lights, without creating materials, with nothing. You just create the renderer, hit render, and V-Ray will give the same result. So let me disable this one and enable V-Ray RT. And you will see that the same mesh is rendered without an additional setup. I've just plugged the geometry in the RT node, and it is being rendered. And the best workflow, in my opinion, is you can create a geometry document renderer, and this one will let me even render inside the Rhino viewport. So let's say I want to start V-Ray RT over here, and here's the component, and it will come with all the additional geometries inside of Rhino. So if I have multiple instances of the Mashrabi, or if I have some additional elements, they will still appear over there. And instead of creating materials over here and creating lights in the Grasshopper node editor, I can just create lights or different elements inside the Rhino scene. And the best part is everything that I showed you so far will work with that geometry. As an example, I can enable the V-Ray clipper, and it will clip the procedural geometry. At this point, let's say I want to change this geometry. I want to close the Mashrabi a little bit, so I'll change the definition. And I think it's this one, or let me see. Come on. Okay, so any change that I introduce will automatically be updated in V-Ray RT. And I believe that we're the first renderer that's doing that inside of Rhino. And we'll improve the workflow a lot in the future. We'll put a lot of effort into that because we know how important this is for our users. Okay, and the last thing that I want to show, which is unique to Rhino, is that in fact you can work on your set, and without even enabling the V-Ray frame buffer, I can start V-Ray RT in the viewport. So that's something that we had in Rhino for a while, and we are currently working on implementing that in SketchUp. I'll show you a video of that in a second. But in my opinion, this is a really cool workflow of working when you work on your sets and when you preview different geometries. You can actually see that the Grasshopper definition is still rendered over here on the ground. Okay, so let me go back to my PowerPoint presentation. And let's now look at in the future a little bit. There have been a lot of updates so far of V-Ray 3 for SketchUp and Rhino, but we plan a really big update, which will be V-Ray 3.5 for both the platforms. And one of the biggest things that we'll implement is the viewport rendering inside of SketchUp. We already have it working. We just have to test it a little more, and we'll make that version available for download. So let me play a quick video in which, and we don't have a sound. There it is. In which I'm using the viewport renderer inside of SketchUp. You can draw custom regions. You can have multiple regions, and I basically did a whole scene setup from start to finish with using that approach. You'll see some examples of library materials in action. Materials can be created from the library, but they can be created from scratch. This is an example of that. And the really cool thing about the viewport renderer is that when you open the frame buffer at the end, you will see the same image in there. So you can basically proceed with adding some color corrections and saving the final thing. Another things which we'll have in V-Ray 3.5, hopefully, is improved GPU support for many of the V-Ray features. So the V-Ray GPU engine will support the subsurface scattering material, displacement, and clipper. Also, we will add VR scans in there. That's the technology that Corey was talking about. And we'll have the VR scene importer in SketchUp and in Rhino. So basically that's it from me. I have to say that we have a trial version of our softwares. So if you have never tried it, just go to our website, download the trial. And it has no limitations whatsoever. For 30 days, you'll be able to evaluate the product fully, test it in your production, and I'm sure you'll like it. So those are some other useful resources, and thanks, guys, for the attention. Thank you. Am I on time?
Hi everyone, we're just going to take a quick 10-minute break. Just one quick note, there's a little bit of a change to the schedule. The 11 o'clock sneak peek at Clever is actually going to be moved to 12:10, and the guest presentation by Scott DeWoody of Gensler is going to be happening at 11 after our break. All right, so let's break, have some coffee, meet and greet, and we'll pick up in a few minutes. And go check out the Iris VR booth that's in the back if you want to check out some of the virtual reality that we have here. Thanks. That was amazing, by the way.
Do you need anything?
Let me see. I got HDMI. I think I should be good.
Is it okay if I leave my things?
Yeah,
here?
that's fine. I think I'll be all right. That SketchUp stuff's looking really good. The viewport render.
Yeah, we actually had it for a while, but we wanted to release a couple of updates before that with some other things, and
Yep.
we'll get there soon.
Are you guys adding MDL into SketchUp as well?
Probably we'll see.
Okay.
It will be super easy for us to have it there, but we'll see whether it makes sense. We always try to keep it as simple as possible, not adding everything right away.
Right.
But now with the App SDK that Corey